Welcome to another edition of From the Front Lines, where we discuss both the day-to-day and one-of-a-kind issues facing real estate managers. Today I'm here with Nate Smoyer of Avail.co, a platform for DIY landlords to advertise, screen tenants, manage lease agreements, and collect rent. Welcome, Nate. I understand that Avail recently conducted a survey around the impacts of COVID on renters and landlords. First, tell us about the study. Who were the respondents and what was the goal of this study?
Yeah, well, thanks so much, Suzanne. And I'm glad to be here. I appreciate the time to be able to talk about some of the work that we've been doing and research around the DIY landlord market and their renters. First off, we've been doing some of these studies for about the last year. So really at the very beginning of March 2020 is when we started doing studies and trying to figure out, hey, how is this pandemic directly affecting those who are described as mom and pop or DIY landlords? Think the investors who have somewhere between 1 and maybe 10 units, but the majority of them really between 1 and 3. So not deep pockets, not Wall Street bankers, not REITs or family offices. They're non-institutional, locally owned rental investors. And we surveyed and we collected responses from roughly 1,200 of these landlords and about 2,500 tenants. And we asked a range of questions, specifically focus on trying to better understand the effects of the pandemic, both in terms of paying rent on time, how are you paying rent, awareness of programs, assistance, both in terms of direct rental or other, past surveys we talked to landlords and to understand if they were aware of forbearance programs. And, it's been fascinating to see and to uncover what we've learned because, if you just look at the numbers of who's paying rent as a gauge to the rental market, you might think that things really aren't that bad. And I'm not here to proclaim that the sky is falling, but there's a lot more to the story than just who's paying rent and who's paying rent on time.
So to that end, what would you say were the top 3 findings of the study?
Yeah, so hard to really break it down or boil it down to the top 3. And, certainly even harder, I think, just to rank them. We spend, although we're pretty fast in turning around these studies and getting the data out, we believe it's sensitive, time it's real estate, time is of the essence. And so it's pretty tough to just say 3, but, over the last year and even including this one of the things that we noticed was that landlords are digging into or have been digging into both their retirement and emergency funds to cover the gaps. This is a problem, right? So everyone looks at the mortgage delinquencies as oftentimes as are people paying their mortgage? And delinquencies weren't skyrocketing. We weren't seeing properties flood the market, and so everyone's paying their mortgage. Well, yes, but think about it. When people are digging into their retirement savings or emergency funds to be able to pay their mortgage, that's not a sustainable solution. That's not long-term viable. And ultimately, investment owners, property owners tend to skew older. And so when we saw that, it's a very troubling sign because many of them are banking on their investments to be part of, if not their retirement. So, taking the profits or the cash they have set aside now is not a great solution. We also noticed that tenants had continued to pay rent. Now, there's been a decline, and it continues to be a slight decline in who's paying rent in full and paying rent on time. But when we dug into it, that's when we found that, a large majority of tenants were still dependent on the stimulus efforts. They were still dependent on other government programs, and they were borrowing. So friends and family, credit cards, personal loans. And put that together, if tenants are borrowing and landlords are cashing in their emergency funds, that's not long-term stable. That can't remain for a long period of time. One item on this most recent survey that we uncovered was that there's a troubling trend of lack of awareness. And so we specifically in this survey wanted to focus on stimulus funding and rental assistance. And what we found was that only 31% of tenants were aware of the assistance programs out there. They don't know. Like, so you think about it, 3 out of 10 know. So that means 7 out of 10 don't know. That's just not good enough. And then, almost half landlords are aware of assistance and relief programs. So, there's been multiple relief programs that have launched that didn't give away or, distribute or deploy all of the capital designated to go to DIY and independent landlords. I think Washington, D.C. was one of the cities that had a significant trouble with this. And it comes down to there's a total lack of awareness of the programs. And it's really hard because, this is a fragmented market. They're not centralized. It's not like you can, just send it to 1 or 2 outlets and reach all of them. And it's very difficult. But even for the landlords who were aware of some of the programs, they cited several barriers to being able to get to that relief, or it created enough resistance stopping them from pursuing the relief. So some programs require mandate, needing to waive rights to evictions for a set period of time, and tends to be regardless of payment or other issues. Communication with tenants, being able to communicate effectively or wanting to communicate effectively between tenants and landlords has affected the ability not just to get the information needed to apply for assistance programs, but even wanting to. Overall uncertainty, that what should I do or how does that even work? I mean, they might have heard of it, but they just don't know where to go. And then having to waive late fees. Those are just some of the reasons. Those were the top 4 cited reasons as to why, or barriers that landlords cited to applying for rental assistance. And then one really interesting thing that I'll add on here that stood out. And I think if you look at the jobs numbers for last year, this is supported by the macro trend of who lost their jobs and who didn't, is that women who are renters, or renters who identify as women, have been hit harder by this pandemic than men. So 75% of women indicated they're having a tough time paying their rent, whereas 62% of men indicated they're having a tough time paying rent. And why that is, I mean, there's, you could come up with a lot of different theories, but the job, if you look at the macro trend and you try to pair it with other things that are happening, the job losses for women outnumbered the job losses for men. When I think at the end of the year, the net, I should have had those numbers ready to roll here, but that's a really interesting side effect of this pandemic, and the broader scope of things here is just to remember that one sweeping policy, one idea doesn't solve challenges like this. It's very complicated. There's lots of nuances and lots of different ways it affects different people.
Absolutely. And so what did the study reveal in terms of expected rental income loss this year?
Yeah, I wish I had the like a better ability to pull together the cumulative losses of what that would be, and we don't quite have data to that level. However, what we were able to see is that a lot of landlords do expect to receive less rent over the next several months. And true, while for some it may not be an actual loss on the year, if they were to look at comparison of what they had set to collect in rent and what they actually collect, it will be a loss. 50% of landlords expect to experience a loss over the next 3 months, and 28% of them citing that they're not sure they'll be collecting rent at all. So, unfortunately, there's still a fair amount of uncertainty. Now, the last stimulus that went out, hopefully that will provide a lot of relief. But if you've been borrowing for the last several months, you're still likely behind, even with the last run of stimulus. And remember, these are DIY landlords, independent landlords, 1 to 10 unit owners, mom pop investors. A lot of them have full-time jobs themselves, meaning that they are just as at risk of losing their work or their full-time income stream. So the ability to absorb these losses isn't like those of the institutional investors. It isn't like the ability of maybe a family office or a REIT. So it's really challenging and troubling to hear when if you're not collecting the rent that's required to, you have to put money aside for the rainy day fund and for capital expenditures and ongoing maintenance. And we did see an uptick in landlords saying that, hey, right now, I don't have the extra funds to put anything aside or to do anything with fixing or maintaining the unit. And ultimately, that leads to a cascading of problems when properties become neglected or not upkept. When they live in, they're getting used, and they need repairs, they need improvements over time. And if that doesn't happen, there's a cascading of problems that follow that.
So you mentioned there's an awareness issue. So are landlords receiving what they need right now, both in terms of information, but also in terms of rental assistance?
Yeah, from what we can see in our surveys, from who I've spoken to in other forums I've participated in, that the reality is no. It's extremely challenging to get information to the individual property owners, and when you try to do it from a federal level, it's going to be far too it's far too broad a messaging to be able to reach them directly. It really has to get to the local level somehow in a coordinated fashion. I think that's one of the challenges in this. It's not very clear. Even the eviction moratorium itself has a lot of ambiguity to it. There's just so much uncertainty, and that creates problems and confusion. We saw in previous surveys that we ran that the rules around forbearance, landlords weren't sure if they qualified and didn't really know how to clearly go check if they qualified. And it sounds like it shouldn't be that hard, but if you only have 1 or 2 units, it's not like you're buying properties every year. So you don't have necessarily a personal connection at a mortgage company to call all the time, or know who to go to. And that can be a daunting thing added on to the stresses of a pandemic. So ultimately, at the end of the day, we haven't been able to get this information to DIY landlords well enough and their tenants to be able to help remedy the issues.
So if the tenant awareness is even lower, what is the survey showing in that regard?
Yeah, it's almost, for every, so it's about, 3 out of 10 tenants are aware of the programs, and about 5 out of 10 landlords are aware of programs. So landlords are more aware than tenants in general, because, it's their business, right? They should be, and they're looking for that. At the same time, though, one of the earliest of gaps we found is just the communication gap. There's just a communication gap between landlords and tenants and how they communicate around this. And there's been, lots of different reasons cited as to why, maybe they didn't get along at the beginning, maybe they don't know how to communicate, maybe there's not a designated channel for that. There's lots of different varying reasons, but ultimately there's a significant communication problem, and it's not necessarily getting to the landlord and then immediately passing down to the tenant, but it's also not getting to the tenant and immediately passing through to the landlord. And you need both sides in many cases to work in a coordinated fashion to get to the remedy, whether it's a rent relief or some sort of buyout of rent, past rents sort of thing. And that just makes it more challenging because it requires multiple actors to move towards the same solution.
So you mentioned that women are one of the demographics that are being hit hard right now. Are there any other groups that are struggling to pay rent right now?
Yeah, that's a really great question. We do collect, we try to collect demographic information. So all the information we collect is anonymized, and the demographic information is, voluntary after the primary portion of the survey. We have seen other gaps. One of the gaps that we've seen is probably not surprising, is that those who are in the bottom 20% of income percentile have the most challenge in paying the rent. They have the most back rents or the highest balance owed, and they have the toughest time paying in full. And that's probably not surprising. I mean, that tends to be a lot of service industry jobs, and a lot of service industry jobs in the past year have been hit the hardest. Even if you were in a role that was deemed an essential role, hours were cut back or number of positions were cut back. And so that is an unfair disadvantage to a lot of people who, are in those jobs or in those income brackets. And really unfortunate, it's a double whammy, because they're also the people who have the least amount of cushion to absorb any of this. And so, that's where you see the scenarios of the tenant is unable to pay, and it's not a withholding rent from the landlord, they're just unable to pay, and it's outside of anything in their control. We have, some of our previous studies looked into this, and this isn't on the tenant side, on the landlord side, but on the landlord side, what we saw is some of the proposals to, how they wanted to move forward, and even the eviction moratorium was disproportionately affecting Black and Hispanic landlords than it was white landlords. And there's nothing in the, it's fascinating to see that, because it's just I guess the big takeaway here is that real estate and where we live and the rentals market is very local. It's very it's to the community level. There's lots of layers to it, and big policies, big large sweeping policies sometimes can't solve those problems, because there's just nuances, and unfortunately there's unintended consequences to some of the challenges. And that's why we think it's so important that we do these. It's really important to tell the stories of what people are experiencing and going through as best as we can. And one of the reasons why we continue to do this, so that, and our hopes is that the information will be shared and get to the people who need to see it, so they'll understand what's going on with the neighborhood rentals. Your mom and pop independent investors. Essentially they're the small business that every community has, and I think is good for every community.
And Nate, if listeners would want to view the survey results for themselves, where would they go?
A lot of our studies and anything that's related to the pandemic, we've published on avail.co/COVID-19, all one word, COVID-19. And that's a directory. So that directory has some government links for resources. It has any of the reports that we published for landlords, as well as some resources for tenants. At the top of that page, you'll find the full report recap of our latest survey. And you can choose to download that. And then in the future, we plan on publishing 2 to 3 of these reports every quarter. And we have a special reports email list that goes to. So if you go to avail.co/COVID-19 and you get that report, you can also opt in for our special reports email list. And there's no ads. It's not a product pitch. That email list is specifically and exclusively reserved only for industry related studies that our team either conducts or partners on. Our partners on this one, by the way, has been Urban Institute. They've been really great to work with. And I would encourage you to check out what Urban Institute is publishing. They also do their own take on our studies and help us think of ways to consider the data in ways that we wouldn't necessarily think of considering it, or ways to look at it. So, they've been great partners, and we'll continue working with them throughout the year on similar efforts.
Great. Thank you so much for your time, Nate. Visit irem.org for more knowledge to take on real estate management's most dynamic challenges. That's www.irem.org.